Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 of the most disturbing true horror stories ever to emerge from the quiet back roads and rain-soaked towns of the Pacific Northwest. These are not urban legends or exaggerated tales, but confessions and accounts rooted in the lives of people who called these shadowed valleys and isolated communities their home. The stories you will hear tonight come from individuals who believe their experiences would never be believed. And yet, each account is tangled with real names, local history, and unsettling details that only those who lived through them could share. Some of these encounters have left scars on entire communities. Some have resulted in investigations, and all have been pieced together from real witness testimony, public records, or never-before-heard confessions. From unsolved disappearances on snowbound highways to unnatural happenings in lonely cabins. These are the types of stories locals only whisper about when the rain is coming down hard and the fog erases the world outside. If authentic horror is what keeps you up at night, subscribe to Buried Files and ring the notification bell, because nothing we share here is rumor. These are the dark corners hiding in small towns you thought you knew. After you listen, share your own stories or theories in the comments below. Now, settle in as we open the files on the secrets the Pacific Northwest never wanted you to know. My name is Ryan, and what I am about to tell you happened during the summer of 2019 when I was 23 years old and working as a seasonal lighthouse keeper on Sentinel Rock, a small island off the southern coast of Oregon. I had dropped out of college the previous spring after my father passed away, and I needed to get away from everything and everyone I knew. When I saw the posting for a lighthouse keeper position that required living alone on an island for 3-month stretches, it felt like exactly what I needed. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward. Most importantly, there would be nobody around to ask me how I was doing or tell me that time heals all wounds. Sentinel Rock Lighthouse sits on a jagged piece of land about 4 miles off the coast, accessible only by boat when the weather permits. The island itself is less than 2 acres of rock, scrub grass and wind-bent trees that look like they are trying to crawl away from the ocean. The lighthouse has been automated since the 1980s. But the Coast Guard still maintains a keeper on site during the summer months to handle maintenance, monitor equipment, and serve as an emergency contact point for fishing vessels in the area. The job was simple enough. I would check the light mechanism twice daily, maintain the foghorn system, keep the solar panels clean, document weather conditions, and perform basic repairs as needed. A supply boat came every Thursday to drop off food, fuel, and mail. And I had a radio to check in with my supervisor on the mainland each morning and evening. The first month passed without incident. I settled into a routine that felt almost meditative. I would wake at dawn, make coffee on the small propane stove in the keeper's cottage attached to the lighthouse base, and walk the perimeter of the island to check for debris or damage from the previous night. The mornings were usually foggy, and I grew to love the way the mist clung to everything and muffled all sound except for the waves and the gulls. After my morning radio check-in, I would spend a few hours on maintenance tasks, then make lunch and read or listen to music in the afternoon. Evenings were reserved for the sunset watch and my second radio check-in. By the time full darkness arrived, I was usually exhausted enough to fall asleep without thinking too much about the life I had left behind on the mainland. It was during my 6th week on the island that I started noticing things that did not fit into the patterns I'd come to expect. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late July. I was making my usual walk around the island when I noticed boot prints in a patch of mud near the eastern cliff edge. They were not my prints. Mine were from hiking boots with a distinct waffle tread pattern. But these prints were from work boots with a smooth sole and a heel. They led from the rocky beach area up toward the cliff, but they did not lead back. I stood there for several minutes, staring at those prints and trying to make sense of them. The supply boat had come and gone 2 days earlier, and the crew never left the small dock area on the western side of the island. I wondered if perhaps the previous keeper had left something behind and returned briefly to retrieve it. But that made no sense. The prints were fresh, made within the last day or so based on how crisp the edges were. I followed the prints to the cliff edge and looked over. It was a sheer drop of maybe 80 feet to the rocks and churning water below. There was no way down and certainly no way back up. I told myself that I must have been mistaken about the prints, that maybe they were older than I thought, or that I had somehow made them myself and forgotten. But I knew that was not true. Those prints were not mine, and they had not been there the day before. I mentioned the boot prints during my evening radio check-in, keeping my tone casual and unconcerned. My supervisor, a man named Dale who worked out of the Coast Guard station in Newport, told me that the previous keeper had left in early May and that nobody had been on the island since I arrived except for the supply boat crew. He suggested that maybe I had seen animal tracks or natural formations in the mud that resembled boot prints. I did not argue with him, but I also did not believe him. I know what boot prints look like, and I know the difference between tracks made by a person and marks made by nature. The second incident occurred about a week later. I had been working in the lighthouse tower, cleaning the lamp housing and checking the rotation mechanism, when I came back down to the cottage to find that several items in the main room had been moved. It was not dramatic. The logbook I kept on the small desk had been opened to a page I had not been looking at. 3 coffee mugs that I had left in the dish rack by the sink were now arranged in a straight line on the counter. The chair at the desk had been turned to face the window instead of the desk. Small things, but things I knew I had not done. I lived alone in a space barely larger than a studio apartment. I knew where I put things, and I knew when those things had been moved. I searched the cottage and the lighthouse tower thoroughly. Both doors had been locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. The windows were all latched from the inside. There was nowhere for a person to hide. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had probably moved those things myself without thinking about it. But the unease settled into my chest and would not leave. Over the next 2 weeks, the incidents continued and escalated. I would find tools moved in the small maintenance shed. The foghorn would activate in the middle of the night when there was no fog and no reason for it to sound. I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake in the darkness and listening for sounds that should not be there. During one of my walks around the island, I found more boot prints, this time near the cottage door. They appeared overnight, and again they did not lead away from where they stopped. It was on a Thursday in mid-August when I found the videotape. The supply boat had come and gone, and I was organizing the storage closet in the cottage when I noticed that one of the floorboards in the back corner was loose. I pried it up, thinking I might find evidence of water damage or rot that needed repair, and instead I found a small plastic storage box wedged into the space between the floor joists. Inside the box was a VHS tape in an unmarked sleeve, a small notebook, and a Polaroid photograph of a man I did not recognize. The man in the photo was probably in his 50s, with a thick beard and tired eyes. He was standing in front of the lighthouse, wearing the same style of Coast Guard utility jacket that I had been issued. I took the box back to the main room and examined the notebook first. It was a personal journal, not an official log. The entries were dated from April through September of 1979. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but I managed to make out enough to understand that the author was a lighthouse keeper named Martin Carver, who had worked on Sentinel Rock during that season. The early entries were mundane observations about weather, maintenance tasks, and the isolation. But as the weeks progressed, the tone shifted. Carver wrote about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps on the tower stairs when he knew he was alone, about finding objects moved and doors opened that he had locked. In the final entries, his handwriting became more erratic. He wrote about visitors who came at night when the fog was thick, about figures he could see moving outside the cottage windows, but who left no footprints in the daylight. The last entry was dated September 18th, 1979. It read, "They are here again tonight. I can hear them on the stairs. I do not think they are human. I do not think they want me here. If anyone finds this, do not stay on this island after dark. Do not watch the fog." My hands were shaking as I set the notebook aside and picked up the VHS tape. I did not have a way to play it on the island. There was no television, no VCR, nothing but the radio and my own battery-powered devices. But I knew I would not be able to let it go. I needed to see what was on that tape. The rest of that day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I completed my tasks mechanically, barely paying attention to what I was doing. During my evening radio check-in, I asked Dale if he knew anything about a keeper named Martin Carver, who had worked on Sentinel Rock in 1979. There was a long pause before Dale responded. He told me that Carver had been found dead at the base of the Eastern Cliffs in late September of that year. The official report had ruled it an accidental death, suggesting that Carver had lost his footing and fallen, but the report had been marked as inconclusive due to some unexplained circumstances. Dale did not elaborate on what those circumstances were, and I did not push him. But I could hear something in his voice, a hesitation that told me there was more to the story than he was willing to share over the radio. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed in the small cottage bedroom, listening to the wind and the waves and the creaking of the lighthouse structure. Around 2 in the morning, a thick fog rolled in from the ocean. I could hear the foghorn activate automatically, its low, mournful sound cutting through the darkness at regular intervals. And then I heard something else. Footsteps on the metal stairs of the lighthouse tower. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing from the base toward the lamp room at the top. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was the wind, or the structure settling, or some combination of normal sounds that my exhausted mind was interpreting as footsteps. But I knew better. I had lived on that island for 2 months. I knew every sound the lighthouse made, and this was not one of them. These were footsteps, and they were climbing the stairs. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept beside my bed and made my way to the door that connected the cottage to the lighthouse base. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely turn the handle. The door opened into darkness. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel something in that darkness, something that did not belong. I raised the flashlight and shone it up the spiral staircase. For a moment, I saw nothing. And then, perhaps 30 feet up the stairs, I saw them. Figures, multiple figures, standing motionless on the stairs. They were human-shaped, but there was something profoundly wrong about the way they stood, the way they held themselves. They did not move. They did not make a sound. They simply stood there in the beam of my flashlight, and I understood with absolute certainty that they were aware of me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I dragged the desk across the floor and wedged it against the door. And then I went to the radio and called for emergency extraction. I told Dale that I needed off the island immediately, that I would not spend another night there under any circumstances. He tried to calm me down, tried to get me to explain what was happening, but I could not find the words. All I could say was that I needed off the island and I needed off now. The Coast Guard sent a boat at first light. The fog had cleared by then, and when I opened the door to the lighthouse base and looked up the stairs, there was nothing there. No figures, no evidence that anyone or anything had been present. But I did not care. I grabbed my personal belongings, left everything else, and got on that boat without looking back. I never returned to Sentinel Rock. I turned in my resignation the same day I reached the mainland. Dale tried to convince me to reconsider, suggested that I had been suffering from isolation-induced stress or hallucinations brought on by lack of sleep. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew what Martin Carver had written in that journal. Whatever is on that island, whatever those things are that appear in the fog, they do not want people there. And I was not going to be the next keeper found dead at the bottom of those cliffs. I still have the VHS tape. I have never watched it, and I never will. Some things are better left buried in the past, hidden beneath loose floorboards on abandoned islands, where nobody wants to look too closely at what might be waiting in the darkness. I moved to Arizona not long after leaving the lighthouse, as far from the ocean as I could get. But even here, thousands of miles from that island, I sometimes wake in the night and hear footsteps on stairs that do not exist. And I wonder if leaving was enough, or if some things follow you no matter how far you run. 3 years ago this month, I volunteered for a search party in the small logging town of Timber Falls, Washington, where I had been living for just under a year. My name is Ella, and I am 31 years old now. But I was 28 when this happened. I had moved to Timber Falls after accepting a remote position with a software company based in Seattle. And I chose the town specifically because it was quiet, affordable, and surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that made me feel like I could breathe after years of living in cramped city apartments. The population was only about 1,200 people, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors brought over casseroles when you first moved in. I thought it was perfect. I thought I had found exactly what I was looking for. On October 14th, an 8-year-old girl named Sophie Brennan disappeared from the playground of Timber Falls Elementary School during afternoon recess. She had been playing on the swings with 2 other girls, and when her friends turned around to call her over to the slide, Sophie was gone. The teachers initiated lockdown procedures immediately and searched the school grounds, but there was no sign of her. The playground backed up against a dense stretch of forest that extended for miles into the mountains. And the assumption was that Sophie had wandered into the trees for some reason and gotten lost. By the time school let out that afternoon, the entire town knew what had happened. Sophie's face was on every storefront window by evening. Her mother appeared on the local news that night, crying and begging for anyone with information to come forward. I did not know the Brennan family personally, but I had seen Sophie around town. She was a small girl with red hair and freckles, always smiling, the kind of child who said hello to strangers in the grocery store. The idea that she was out there somewhere in those woods, alone and scared, was unbearable. So when the call went out for volunteers to join the organized search effort the next morning, I did not hesitate. I showed up at the elementary school parking lot at 7 in the morning, along with what looked like half the town. There must have been 200 people there, maybe more. The county sheriff's department had set up a command center, and search and rescue coordinators were dividing volunteers into teams and assigning grid sections. I was placed in a group of 8 people and assigned to search a section of forest about 2 miles northeast of the school. Our team leader was a man named Garrett, a local firefighter who had search and rescue training. He went over the basics with us before we headed out. Stay within visual or audible range of your assigned partner. Mark any significant findings with the colored tape we had been given. Do not disturb potential evidence. Blow your whistle if you find something or if you need help. It all seemed straightforward enough. My assigned partner was a man who introduced himself as Carter. He was probably in his mid-30s, tall and lean, with the kind of weathered skin that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He told me he worked at one of the lumber mills outside town and that he had lived in Timber Falls his entire life. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a little intense, but I attributed that to the situation. Everyone was on edge. Our section of the search grid started at a fire road and extended deep into old-growth forest, where the canopy was so thick that the ground beneath was perpetually dim and damp. We moved slowly, calling Sophie's name every few minutes and scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance or tracks. The other members of our team spread out in a line, each pair maintaining their assigned spacing. For the first hour, we found nothing. Just trees and ferns, and the occasional startled deer. Carter barely spoke except to suggest we move in a particular direction or to point out areas that looked like they might be worth examining more closely. I noticed that he kept suggesting we push deeper into the forest, beyond the boundaries of our assigned grid. When I mentioned that we were supposed to stay within our section, he said that the grids were just guidelines and that we needed to cover as much ground as possible while we still had daylight. By mid-morning, we had moved far enough from the fire road that I could no longer hear the other search teams. The forest had grown quieter and darker, the trees older and more densely packed. I was starting to feel uncomfortable with how far we had gone, and I told Carter that I thought we should loop back and rejoin the others. He stopped walking and turned to face me, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach tighten. He said we were close to something, that he could feel it, and that we just needed to keep going a little further. I asked him what he meant by feeling close to something, and he did not answer directly. He just said that the town needed closure one way or another, and that someone had to be willing to do what was necessary. I did not understand what he meant by that, but I knew I did not like it. I told him again that we needed to go back, and this time I made it clear that I was not asking for his opinion. He stared at me for a long moment, and I became acutely aware of how alone we were. There was nobody within shouting distance. Nobody would hear me if I called for help. And Carter was bigger than me, stronger than me, and he was looking at me in a way that made every instinct I had scream that something was very wrong. That was when I noticed his arms. He was wearing a long-sleeved flannel shirt, but the cuffs had ridden up slightly, and I could see fresh scratches running from his wrists up toward his elbows. They were not the kind of scratches you get from brushing against blackberry bushes or catching your arm on a branch. They were deep, parallel gouges, the kind you get from fingernails, from someone fighting back. I felt my blood go cold. I thought about Sophie, about her small hands and how hard she would have fought if someone had grabbed her. I thought about how Carter had been so insistent on pushing deeper into the forest, so certain that we were close to something. And I thought about how he had phrased it. The town needs closure one way or another. I forced myself to stay calm. I told Carter that I was feeling dizzy and needed to sit down for a minute. He seemed annoyed, but nodded and said we could take a short break. I sat down on a fallen log and made a show of drinking from my water bottle while my mind raced through my options. I had a whistle in my jacket pocket, but I was not sure if anyone was close enough to hear it. I had my phone, but there was no cell service this deep in the forest. My best chance was to get away from Carter, make it back to the fire road where there would be other searchers. But I could not just run. He was faster than me, and if he realized I was trying to get away from him, I did not know what he would do. I told Carter that I thought I had twisted my ankle when I sat down, and that I needed him to check if it was swelling. It was a weak excuse, but it was the best I could come up with in the moment. He crouched down in front of me, and the second his attention was on my boot, I pulled the whistle from my pocket and blew it as hard as I could. 3 short blasts, the signal for help needed. Carter's head snapped up, his expression transforming into something ugly and furious. He lunged toward me, but I was already moving, scrambling backward off the log and putting distance between us. I blew the whistle again, over and over, backing away from him and screaming for help at the top of my lungs. I do not know if he would have caught me if I had been alone. But the whistle worked. I heard voices responding, heard people crashing through the underbrush toward us. Carter must have heard them too, because he stopped advancing and just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Within minutes, Garrett and 2 other members of our search team broke through the trees. I was sobbing and shaking, barely able to explain what had happened. I pointed at Carter's arms, at the scratches, and I told them what he had said about closure and about being close to something. Garrett's expression changed immediately. He told one of the other volunteers to radio for law enforcement and told Carter not to move. Carter did not run. He did not try to explain himself. He just stood there with this blank expression on his face, like none of it mattered anymore. When the sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes later, they handcuffed him and searched the area where he had been trying to lead me. About half a mile further into the forest, they found disturbed earth, freshly turned soil that had been partially covered with branches and leaves. They brought in cadaver dogs. They found Sophie 3 hours later, buried in a shallow grave exactly where Carter had been leading me. The forensic evidence told the story that Sophie could not. Carter had been at the school that day. He had no children of his own, no reason to be there. But nobody had questioned it because Timber Falls was a small town where people trusted their neighbors. He had grabbed Sophie during recess when none of the teachers were looking, dragged her into the woods, and killed her. The scratches on his arms were defensive wounds. She had fought him. An 8-year-old girl had fought for her life, and she had marked her killer in the process. But it had not been enough to save her. Carter confessed to everything once he was in custody. He said he had not planned it, that he had seen Sophie on the playground and something inside him had snapped. He said he volunteered for the search party because he wanted to make sure her body was found in a way that would not lead back to him. He was going to lead me to the gravesite and then act like we had discovered it together, play the role of the devastated volunteer who had stumbled upon the worst possible outcome. But I had noticed the scratches. I had seen through him just enough to save myself, even if I could not save Sophie. The trial happened 8 months later. Carter Wilson was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sophie's mother gave a victim impact statement that broke everyone in that courtroom. She talked about how her daughter had been stolen from her, how she would never see her grow up or graduate or get married or have children of her own. She talked about how Timber Falls was supposed to be safe, how she had raised her daughter in this town specifically because she thought nothing bad could happen here. And then she looked directly at me and thanked me for blowing that whistle, for trusting my instincts, for doing what Sophie could not do for herself. I have never felt so sick with guilt in my entire life. I did not save Sophie. I saved myself. And that is something I have to live with every single day. I moved away from Timber Falls 6 months after the trial. I could not stay there anymore. Every street corner, every store, every face reminded me of that day in the forest. People treated me like a hero, but I did not feel like one. I felt like a coward who had been too slow to understand what was happening until it was already too late. I still have nightmares about it. In my dreams, I am back in those woods, and I am following Carter deeper and deeper into the trees. And I never blow the whistle. I just keep walking until we reach that disturbed earth. And then I wake up gasping and crying and hating myself for not seeing it sooner. I do not volunteer for anything anymore. I keep to myself, stay away from small towns, and I do not trust easily. People say that I did everything right, that there was no way I could have known what Carter was planning until I saw those scratches on his arms. But they are wrong. I should have known. I should have felt it earlier. And maybe if I had, Sophie Brennan would still be alive. That is the truth I carry with me. That is the weight that never gets lighter. And that is why I will never forget the face of the man who smiled at me in that elementary school parking lot and asked if I wanted to be his search partner. I have worked as an audio engineer for 12 years, and in that time, I have digitized thousands of hours of old recordings. Vinyl records, cassette tapes, reel-to-reel masters, DAT tapes, everything you can imagine from the analog era that people want preserved in digital format. My name is Nora. I am 36 years old, and I live in Vancouver, British Columbia. Most of my work is boring but satisfying. Old wedding videos, corporate training films from the 1980s, demo recordings from bands that never made it big. I have heard it all, or at least I thought I had, until I was hired to work on the Riverside Sound Studio archive in the fall of 2022. Riverside Sound was a small recording studio that operated in a rural town called Maple Ridge, about an hour east of Vancouver, from 1974 until it closed suddenly in 1985. The building had sat empty for decades, slowly deteriorating, until a real estate developer bought the property with plans to renovate it into a boutique hotel. During the renovation, workers discovered the basement, which had been sealed off and forgotten. Inside were dozens of cardboard boxes filled with reel-to-reel tapes, session notes, and equipment. The developer contacted me through a mutual friend, explaining that he wanted the tapes cataloged and digitized before deciding what to do with them. He thought there might be some historical or archival value, and he was willing to pay well for a thorough job. I picked up the boxes on a Monday morning in October. There were 23 boxes in total, each one packed with unmarked or poorly labeled tapes. The developer gave me a key to the building so I could work on site if I wanted to see the space where the recordings had been made. But I declined. I prefer working in my own studio where I have my equipment set up exactly the way I need it. I loaded the boxes into my van and drove back to my workspace in East Vancouver, already planning how I would organize the project. The first week of work was exactly what I expected. I started with the tapes that had the most detailed labels, figuring those would be the easiest to catalog. There were recordings of local rock bands with names like The Voltage and Cascade, demo tracks that were rough but enthusiastic. There were commercial jingles for businesses that no longer existed, radio advertisements for car dealerships and furniture stores, even a few recordings of what sounded like high school choir performances. Nothing remarkable, but everything got the same treatment. I would play each tape, make notes about the content, date if available, and audio quality, then digitize it and save the file with proper metadata. It was methodical work, and I found it almost meditative. It was during the second week that I found the tape that changed everything. I had moved on to a box of tapes that had minimal labeling, most of them marked only with dates or numbers. One tape in particular caught my attention because unlike all the others, this one had a label that said Session 7. Do not in handwriting that looked hurried and angry. The letters were pressed so hard into the paper that they had torn through in places. Every instinct I had told me to set that tape aside, to maybe even throw it away without listening to it. But I am a professional, and part of my job is to document everything, even the things that someone clearly did not want documented. I threaded the tape onto my machine and pressed play. For the first few seconds, there was nothing but the hiss of blank tape, and I thought maybe it was empty. But then I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, calm and measured, with the kind of neutral tone you might use when reading a weather report. He said, "This is session 7 with subject 3, November 19th, 1982. There was a pause, and then I heard another voice, a woman's voice, and she sounded terrified. She said, "Please, I do not understand what you want from me." The man's voice responded, "I want you to tell me about the others. I want you to tell me their names." I sat there in my studio, staring at the tape machine, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It did not sound like a recording session for music or a commercial. It sounded like an interrogation. The woman on the tape was crying, her words broken and desperate. She kept saying she did not know what he was talking about, that she did not know any names, that she just wanted to go home. The man's voice never changed. He stayed calm, almost clinical, as he repeated his questions. "Where did you meet them? What did they tell you? How many others are there?" The woman's answers became more frantic, more incoherent, until finally she started screaming. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick to my stomach. I sat there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to destroy the tape, to pretend I had never heard it. But another part of me, the part that had spent 12 years documenting history, knew that I could not do that. If what I was hearing was real, if this was evidence of something terrible, then it needed to be turned over to the authorities. I took a deep breath and pressed play again. The tape continued for another 40 minutes. The man asked the same questions over and over, sometimes softly, sometimes with an edge of irritation in his voice. The woman's responses became weaker as the recording went on, her voice hoarse from screaming. At one point, she said a name. She said, "Jennifer." Her name was Jennifer. The man's voice brightened slightly, like a teacher pleased with a student's correct answer. He said, "Good, that is good. Now tell me about Diane." The woman said she did not know anyone named Diane, but the man insisted. He said, "You knew her. You all knew each other. That is how this works." Near the end of the tape, the woman stopped responding altogether. I could hear her breathing, ragged and shallow, but she did not speak. The man's voice continued, asking questions into the silence. And then, just before the tape ran out, he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "I think that is enough for today. We will try again with the next one. There are always more." The tape hissed into silence, and I sat there staring at the machine, my mind trying to process what I had just heard. I immediately started searching through the rest of the tapes, looking for anything else labeled "Session." I found 2 more. Session 4, "Do Not," and Session 9, "Do Not," both in the same angry handwriting. I did not want to listen to them, but I knew I had to. Session 4 was similar to Session 7, a different woman's voice, the same man's voice, the same questions. Session 9 was worse. The woman on that tape was barely coherent. Her words slurred like she had been drugged or beaten into submission. The man's voice was more impatient on that recording, his questions sharper and more accusatory. At one point he said, "If you do not cooperate, I will have to move on to the girl we picked up last week. Is that what you want?" I spent the next 2 days researching Riverside Sound Studio and its owner. His name was Gordon Hayes, and he had opened the studio in 1974 as a side business while working as a music teacher at the local high school. According to old newspaper articles, he had been well liked in the community, known for giving free lessons to underprivileged kids and volunteering at the community center. The studio closed in 1985 with no explanation. Hayes had simply locked the doors one day and never came back. I found his obituary from 2003. He had died of a heart attack at the age of 67, survived by a son named Michael who still lived in Maple Ridge. Next, I started searching for missing persons cases in the Maple Ridge area from the early 1980s. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. Between 1981 and 1983, 3 women had disappeared from the area. Jennifer Holt, 22 years old, was last seen leaving a bar in downtown Maple Ridge in March of 1981. Diane Kruger, 19 years old, disappeared from a shopping mall parking lot in August of 1982. Rebecca Chow, 26 years old, vanished while walking home from her job at a grocery store in November of 1983. All 3 cases were still unsolved. All 3 women were presumed dead, but their bodies had never been found. I listened to the tapes again, this time making detailed notes about everything the man said. He had mentioned Jennifer by name, and he had mentioned Diane. He had talked about the next one and the girl we picked up last week. The dates on the tape labels matched the timeline of the disappearances. Session 7 was dated November 19, 1982, which was 3 months after Diane Kruger disappeared. The voice on that tape could have been Diane. I had no way to know for certain, but the more I listened, the more convinced I became that I was hearing the final hours of women who had been taken, interrogated, and murdered. I contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on a Thursday morning. I spoke to a detective in the Major Crimes Unit and explained what I had found. He was skeptical at first, which I understood. A box of old tapes from a defunct recording studio does not exactly scream credible evidence. But when I played portions of the recordings over the phone, his tone changed. He told me not to touch anything else, not to listen to any more tapes, and that someone would be at my studio within the hour. 2 detectives arrived and took possession of all 23 boxes. They asked me questions for over 2 hours, documenting everything I had done since receiving the tapes, every tape I had listened to, every note I had made. One of the detectives, a woman named Constable Reeves, told me that they would have the recordings analyzed by forensic audio specialists and that they would compare the voices on the tapes to any existing recordings of the missing women. She also told me that I might be called as a witness if the case ever went to trial, though she warned me that it was unlikely given how much time had passed and the fact that the main suspect was already dead. The RCMP executed a search warrant on Gordon Hayes' former property in Maple Ridge 2 weeks later. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they found human remains buried in 3 separate locations on the property. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Jennifer Holt, Diane Kruger, and Rebecca Chow. All 3 women had been dead for over 40 years. The tapes I had found were the only evidence that explained what had happened to them in their final days. The case made national news. Gordon Hayes was identified posthumously as a serial killer who had used his recording studio as a cover for abducting and torturing women. His son Michael, who was 62 years old and had been living quietly in Maple Ridge for his entire life, was questioned extensively, but never charged with any crimes. He claimed he had no knowledge of what his father had done, that he had never been allowed in the basement of the studio, and that his father had always told him the space was for equipment storage only. The police believed him. There was no evidence to suggest he had been involved. I have not been able to work on any audio project since turning over those tapes. Every time I sit down at my equipment, every time I press play on a recording, I hear that man's calm, clinical voice asking his questions. I hear those women begging for their lives. I know that what I did was important, that I gave those families closure and brought a monster's crimes to light even after his death. But it doesn't make it easier. It does not make the nightmares stop. I cannot listen to anything anymore without wondering what horror might be hiding in the silence between the words. The night it snowed in late April was the night I saw something I still cannot explain. And I have spent the last 5 years trying to convince myself that it was not real. My name is Aiden. I am 29 years old, and I work for the Washington State Department of Transportation as a highway maintenance technician. Most people do not think much about who keeps the mountain passes clear during bad weather. But it is people like me, working overnight shifts in the middle of nowhere while everyone else is safe at home. I took the job right out of high school because it paid well and did not require a college degree, and for the most part, I have never regretted it. But that night in April of 2020 changed something in me. It made me afraid of the dark in a way I have not been since I was a child. I was assigned to work the overnight shift on Stevens Pass, which is a stretch of US Route 2 that cuts through the Cascade Mountains between the towns of Leavenworth and Skycomish. It is one of the more challenging routes in the state because the elevation reaches over 4,000 feet and the weather can turn dangerous without warning. Most of the winter crews get pulled off the pass by mid-April when the snow finally starts to melt and the avalanche risk drops. But that year, we had a late-season storm system move through that dumped another 8 inches of heavy, wet snow on the pass. I was sent out alone in one of the big maintenance trucks, the kind with a plow blade on the front and a salt spreader on the back, to keep the highway clear overnight while the storm worked its way through the mountains. I left the maintenance yard in Skycomish around 11 at night. The snow was already coming down hard, thick flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. I radioed dispatch to confirm that I was heading up the pass and that I would check in every 2 hours as required. The dispatcher, a woman named Rita, who had been working the overnight shift for as long as I had been with the department, told me to be safe and that she would have coffee waiting when I got back in the morning. I had done this route dozens of times before, and I was not worried. It was just snow, just another shift, just another night on the mountain. The highway was empty. No cars, no trucks, nothing but me and the snow and the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I worked my way up the pass slowly, dropping salt and scraping the snow off the pavement with the plow blade. The radio crackled with static occasionally, but otherwise, it was quiet. I had music playing through my phone, connected to the truck's speakers, some classic rock station that helped break up the monotony of driving the same stretch of road back and forth for hours. By the time I reached the summit around 1 in the morning, the snow had started to ease up a little. I could see maybe 50 feet ahead instead of just 20, and I was starting to think that the worst of the storm had already passed through. That was when I saw her standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard, and the truck slid a little on the fresh snow before coming to a stop maybe 30 feet from where she stood. My first thought was that someone had been in an accident, that a car had gone off the road, and this person had climbed back up to the highway looking for help. But as I sat there staring through the windshield, I realized that something was very wrong. She was a girl, maybe 16 or 17 years old, wearing only a thin white nightgown that was soaked through from the snow. She was barefoot. Her feet were planted in 6 inches of snow, and she was not moving, not shivering, not reacting to the cold at all. She was just standing there in the middle of the highway, staring at my truck. I grabbed the flashlight from the center console and opened the door, calling out to her as I climbed down from the cab. I asked if she was okay, if she had been in an accident, if she needed help. She did not respond. She just stood there, her arms hanging at her sides, her hair plastered to her face from the snow. As I got closer, I could see that she was bleeding. There was a gash on the right side of her head, just above her ear, and blood had run down her neck and stained the collar of her nightgown. Her lips were blue, and her skin was so pale it almost seemed to glow in the beam of my flashlight. I told her that I was going to help her, that I needed her to come with me to the truck where it was warm. She did not move. I got within 10 feet of her and stopped, suddenly aware that her eyes were looking at me but not seeing me. They were unfocused, distant, like she was looking through me at something far away. I called out to her again, asking her name, asking where she had come from. Nothing. She just stood there in the snow, bleeding and silent. I made the decision to go back to the truck and grab a blanket. I thought maybe if I could wrap her up and get her warm, she would start responding. I turned around and walked back to the cab, moving quickly because I was starting to panic. This girl was going to die if I did not get her out of the cold. I climbed into the cab, grabbed the emergency blanket from behind the seat, and turned back around. She was gone. I stood there holding the blanket, staring at the empty highway where she had been standing just seconds before. The snow was falling steadily again, and there were no footprints leading away from the spot where she had been. There was nothing. Just the tire tracks from my truck and the line scraped clean by the plow blade. I called out into the darkness, asking where she had gone, asking if she could hear me. My voice sounded small and swallowed up by the snow and the wind. There was no response. I spent the next 20 minutes searching the area. I walked up and down the highway with my flashlight, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. I checked the shoulders, the tree line, anywhere she could have run to in the few seconds I had my back turned. There was nothing. No footprints, no blood trail, no indication that anyone had been there at all. I tried my radio to call dispatch, but all I got was static. The storm must have been interfering with the signal, or maybe I was too far up the pass for the radio to reach the towers. My cell phone had no service either. I was alone on that mountain with no way to contact anyone and no explanation for what I had just seen. I got back in the truck and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I told myself that maybe I had been hallucinating, that the isolation and the darkness and the long hours were playing tricks on my mind. But I knew what I had seen. That girl had been real. She had been standing in the middle of the highway, bleeding and barefoot in the snow. And then she had vanished like she had never been there at all. I finished my shift because I did not know what else to do. I drove back and forth along the pass, clearing snow and trying not to think about what I had seen. Every time my headlights swept across the road ahead, I expected to see her standing there again. But she was gone. By the time I made it back down to the maintenance yard in Sky Comish at 6 in the morning, the snow had stopped and the sun was starting to rise. Rita was waiting with coffee like she had promised, and she asked me how the shift had gone. I told her it was fine. I did not tell her about the girl. I went home and tried to sleep, but I could not stop thinking about it. I kept seeing her face, those unfocused eyes, the blood running down her neck. I got up around noon and turned on the local news, half expecting to see a report about a missing girl or a car accident on Stevens Pass. There was nothing. I checked the news websites, the police reports, everything I could think of. Nothing. It was like she had never existed. 2 days later, I was at the maintenance yard getting ready for another shift when one of the other guys, a veteran technician named Tom, mentioned that he had seen something on the news about a body being found near Stevens Pass. I asked him what he meant, and he pulled out his phone and showed me the article. A hiker had discovered human remains in a ravine about 3 miles off the highway, not far from the summit. The remains were identified as those of a 17-year-old girl named Paige Summers, who had been reported missing from her home in Leavenworth 2 days earlier. According to the medical examiner, she had died from exposure after fleeing her home in the middle of the night. Her family said she had been trying to escape an abusive situation. The estimated time of death was late evening on April 23rd, which was the night before I saw her on the highway. I read that article 3 times, and each time I felt sicker. The girl I had seen was already dead when I encountered her. She had been dead for over 24 hours, but I had seen her standing there in the snow, bleeding and barefoot, staring at me with those empty eyes. I do not believe in ghosts. I never have. I am a practical person who works with machines and follows procedures and does not put much stock in anything that cannot be explained with logic. But I cannot explain what I saw that night. I cannot explain how a dead girl appeared in the middle of a highway and then vanished without leaving a trace. I still work for the Department of Transportation. I still do overnight shifts on the mountain passes. But I do not drive Stevens Pass anymore. I requested a transfer to a different route, and my supervisor approved it without asking questions. I think he could tell that something had changed in me, that I was not the same person who used to joke around in the break room and volunteer for the worst shifts. I do not talk about what I saw that night. People would think I was crazy, or that I made it up, or that I was looking for attention. But I know what I saw. I saw Paige Summers standing in the snow, and I think she was trying to tell me something. I think she was trying to show me what had happened to her, to make sure someone knew that she had not just disappeared. She had died alone and afraid. And maybe she needed someone to witness that. Even if it was just a highway maintenance worker who could not do anything to help her. I think about her all the time. I wonder if she is still out there on that pass, standing in the snow and waiting for someone to see her. I wonder if I was the only one, or if other drivers have seen her too and were too afraid to say anything. I wonder if she found peace, or if she is trapped there forever, reliving the last moments of her life over and over again. I do not have answers to any of those questions. All I have is the memory of her face and the knowledge that there are things in this world that cannot be explained. Things that happen in the darkness when you are alone and far from help. And once you have seen something like that, you can never unsee it. It stays with you, like a shadow that follows you everywhere you go, reminding you that the world is stranger and more terrible than you ever imagined. As part of my graduate thesis on Pacific Northwest settler history and its impact on indigenous populations, I was granted access to the Historical Society archives in the small coastal town of Fern Harbor, Oregon, in the summer of 2021. My name is Claire. I am 33 years old now, and I hold a master's degree in American history from Portland State University. What I discovered during my 3 months of research in that town fundamentally changed not only my thesis, but my entire understanding of how communities protect themselves from the truth. This is a story about silence, about collective amnesia, and about the horrors that people will bury when confronting them becomes too painful. Fern Harbor is a town of approximately 800 people situated on a rocky stretch of coastline about 90 miles south of Portland. It was founded in 1847 by Euro-American settlers who established a fishing and timber economy that persists to this day. The town has that postcard-perfect quality that attracts tourists during the summer months. Victorian houses painted in cheerful colors, a main street lined with antique shops and cafes, a harbor filled with working fishing boats that provide authenticity to the quaint facade. I chose Fern Harbor specifically because preliminary research suggested that the area had a significant indigenous population prior to settler arrival. And I wanted to document what happened to those communities during the colonial period. The Fern Harbor Historical Society operates out of a converted church building on the edge of town. It houses an extensive collection of documents, photographs, personal papers, and artifacts dating back to the town's founding. When I first contacted the society to request access for my research, I was greeted warmly by the president, a woman in her late 70s named Margaret Caldwell. Margaret had lived in Fern Harbor her entire life, as had her parents and grandparents before her. She seemed genuinely excited about my project and told me that the Historical Society was always happy to support academic research. She gave me a key to the archive room and told me I could work there during regular business hours, which were Tuesday through Saturday from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. The first 2 weeks of research proceeded exactly as I had expected. I worked my way through boxes of documents systematically, starting with the earliest records and moving forward chronologically. I found land deeds, census records, business ledgers, personal diaries, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of the town's early years. There were occasional references to the indigenous people who had lived in the area, mostly dismissive or patronizing comments about the local Indians who fished in the harbor or traded with the settlers. But there was surprisingly little documentation of what happened to those communities once the settlers arrived in significant numbers. It was as if the indigenous population had simply vanished from the historical record sometime in the late 1800s, which I knew from experience was not unusual. Settler records often erased indigenous presence either deliberately or through neglect. It was during my third week that I began to notice gaps in the archive that seemed intentional rather than accidental. The collection had excellent documentation for the 1840s, 1850s, 1870s, and beyond. But there was almost nothing from the 1860s. A few scattered business receipts, a couple of letters, but none of the detailed diary entries, newspaper clippings, or official records that I had found for every other decade. When I asked Margaret about it, she smiled in that friendly way she always did, and told me that those years were just not well documented, that perhaps there had been a fire or flood that destroyed the records. It was a plausible explanation, but something about the way she said it made me suspicious. Her tone was too casual, too practiced, like she had given that explanation many times before. I started paying closer attention to what was missing rather than what was present. I noticed that several boxes had labels indicating they should contain materials from the 1860s. But when I opened them, they were either empty or filled with documents from different decades that had clearly been placed there recently. I found references in letters from the 1870s to events that had occurred during the difficult years, or when the school was operating. But no explanation of what those references meant. It was like trying to read a book with entire chapters torn out, and the remaining text carefully edited to avoid mentioning what had been removed. The breakthrough came by accident. I was looking through a box labeled Photographs Miscellaneous 1900-1920 when I found a small envelope that had been tucked into the wrong box. Inside were 5 black and white photographs, slightly faded but still clear enough to see the details. They showed a large wooden building that looked like a dormitory or boarding house surrounded by a high fence. In front of the building stood rows of children, all of them appearing to be indigenous based on their features and the traditional clothing some of them wore. The children looked thin and serious, none of them smiling. Standing behind them were several white adults, stern-faced men and women who I assumed were teachers or administrators. Written on the back of one of the photographs in careful handwriting was a date: June 1863, Fern Harbor Indian School. I sat there staring at those photographs for a long time, my heart pounding. I knew what I was looking at. During the mid to late 1800s, the federal government and various religious organizations established boarding schools designed to assimilate indigenous children into Euro-American culture. These schools were often brutal places where children were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining any connection to their cultures. Many children died in these institutions from disease, malnutrition, and abuse. But the Fern Harbor Indian School was not in any of the historical records I had studied. It had been completely erased from the official history of the town. I continued searching and found more evidence hidden in unlikely places. A ledger tucked into a box of property records that documented expenses for the school between 1861 and 1867. Entries for food purchases that were inadequate for the number of children the photographs suggested were housed there. Entries for medical supplies that consisted mostly of laudanum and carbolic acid. And most damning of all, a handwritten list of names with dates beside them. Dozens of names, all of them indigenous names, all of them with dates ranging from 1862 to 1866. Next to each name was a single word indicating cause of death: fever, consumption, influenza, accident. The list went on for 3 pages. I counted 47 names total, all children based on the ages noted beside their names. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 15. I made copies of everything I found and then went looking for Margaret. I found her in the main office, filing paperwork and humming softly to herself. When I showed her the photographs and asked her about the Fern Harbor Indian School, the expression on her face changed completely. The friendly warmth disappeared, replaced by something hard and defensive. She told me those photographs should not have been in the collection, that they were supposed to have been removed years ago. I asked her why, and she did not answer immediately. She just sat down heavily in her chair and stared at me with this look of profound sadness, mixed with something that might have been shame. She finally told me that everyone in Fern Harbor knew about the school, or at least the older families did. It had been run by a committee of prominent townspeople with funding from the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. The children had been taken from indigenous families throughout the region, sometimes voluntarily by desperate parents who were told their children would receive education and care, more often by force. The conditions at the school had been terrible. Overcrowding, inadequate food, harsh punishments for any child who spoke their native language or resisted the civilizing process. Disease had swept through the school multiple times, and dozens of children had died. When the school finally closed in 1867, the surviving children were either returned to what remained of their families or sent to other institutions further inland. Margaret explained that sometime in the early 1900s, the town had collectively decided to erase the school from the historical record. The building had been torn down and the lumber used for other construction projects. The burial site where the children who died had been interred was on town land on the eastern outskirts, but it had never been marked with headstones or monuments. Instead, it had been allowed to become overgrown and forgotten. Documents relating to the school were systematically removed from the archives. The few photographs that existed were supposed to have been destroyed, but apparently someone had hidden them instead. The town had chosen to forget, to pretend that the school had never existed. Because acknowledging what had happened there meant acknowledging the complicity of the founding families whose descendants still lived in Fern Harbor. I asked Margaret why she was telling me this now. Why she did not just deny everything and tell me the photographs were forgeries or mistakes. She said she was tired of lying, tired of protecting a secret that should never have been kept in the first place. She was the president of the Historical Society, and she had a responsibility to preserve history, not erase it. But she also told me that if I chose to include this information in my thesis or publish it in any way, I would face resistance from the town. There were people in Fern Harbor who still believed that the past should stay buried, that bringing up old horrors served no purpose except to create guilt and division. I left Fern Harbor 2 weeks later with copies of every document and photograph I had found. I contacted indigenous advocacy organizations and cultural preservation groups to inform them of what I had discovered. I also contacted the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office and provided them with the location of the unmarked burial site. Within 3 months, a team had been sent to Fern Harbor to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site. They confirmed the presence of human remains consistent with the number of deaths documented in the ledger I had found. The remains were those of children, some as young as 3 or 4 years old based on skeletal analysis. The discovery made regional news, though it did not receive the national attention that similar findings at boarding schools in other states had garnered. The town of Fern Harbor was forced to acknowledge what had happened, though many residents were angry about what they saw as an attack on their community's reputation. A memorial was eventually erected at the burial site, and representatives from the indigenous nations whose children had been taken to the school performed ceremonies to honor the dead. Margaret Caldwell stepped down as president of the Historical Society shortly after the story became public. I heard from mutual contacts that she received threats and harassment from some town members who blamed her for bringing shame to Fern Harbor. I completed my thesis and received my degree, but the experience changed me in ways I am still processing. I learned that history is not just about what is recorded, but about what is deliberately hidden. I learned that entire communities can agree to forget atrocities when remembering becomes uncomfortable, too threatening to the narratives they have built about themselves. And I learned that sometimes the most important work a historian can do is not discovering new information, but uncovering the information that someone worked very hard to destroy. I think about those children often. I think about their names, carefully written in a ledger by someone who saw them only as entries to be documented and filed away. I think about their faces in those photographs, solemn and afraid, staring into a camera held by people who had taken everything from them. I think about how they died far from their families, buried in unmarked graves, and then forgotten by a town that benefited from erasing their existence. And I think about how many other towns across this country have similar secrets, similar erasures, similar graves that have been allowed to disappear beneath time and silence. That is the real horror. Not the ghosts that might haunt the places where terrible things happened, but the living people who choose to look away and pretend that the past does not matter. Because it does matter. It always matters. And the dead deserve to be remembered, even when remembering is painful. I took the night shift job at the salmon cannery because it paid double what any restaurant gig in town could offer. And I thought I could handle the hours if it meant getting out of debt before winter hit. My name is Tristan. I am 26 years old, and I grew up in Cordova, Alaska, a place where the fishing season means everything. And small town secrets are just part of life. what I discovered in that ancient, rumbling building at the edge of the water for weeks, alone among a handful of exhausted men and women, would haunt me longer than any story I heard from the old-timers in the bar. I am not someone who jumps at shadows. That grew out of me fast in a town where the mountains close in and the wind shakes the walls until you think the whole town might slide into the ocean. But it only takes one night, one moment, to learn how quickly things can go sideways when money and silence are more powerful than justice. The cannery had been operating for close to a century, built by long-gone men whose names were painted on faded boards hanging over skeleton machinery nobody dared to replace. My crew was 5 deep. Nolan, who had worked at that place 15 years and barely spoke. Paige, younger than me and always looking terrified of the foreman. 2 other guys named Mac and Phil, who mostly kept to themselves. And me, filling the spot left vacant by someone who had walked off the job after a week and left all his gear behind. The graveyard shift ran from 8 at night to 6 in the morning, a stretch of hours that felt longer than a full day, eating up your sense of time until you forgot what hour it was unless you glanced at the wall clock above the break room. Most nights were a blur of noise so constant you stopped hearing it. Conveyor belts rattling, gears grinding, the wet slap of fish hitting stainless steel, the occasional curse or shouted warning when a crate shifted wrong and almost took someone's hand off. You learned quick that half the rules posted on the wall would only slow you down. The other half kept you breathing. The accidents were known but rarely talked about. Everyone heard stories. Losing a finger, lacerating an arm, a man crushed under a pallet during a botched forklift job. If anyone asked about complaints or legal trouble, the foreman would snarl and remind you that in a place this small, you either worked here or you starved. The older guys like Nolan kept their heads down and did not say much to anyone except the foreman, who favored them with a nod and first pick of the overtime. Paige had only been working 2 weeks when it happened. We had just hit midnight, the machinery slick with water and fish oil, the smell of metal biting through everything else. I was monitoring the packing line when Paige screamed. I looked over to see her hand caught between a shifting conveyor and the heavy steel gear where the conveyor belt looped back under the sorting table. The sound, high, desperate, unmistakable, was drowned out almost immediately by the rest of the line. But I saw Nolan react before I could move. Slamming the emergency stop so hard, he cracked the plastic casing. Everything shut down except Paige's screaming. Her hand was mangled, but not severed, blood already pooling beneath the conveyor. The foreman barreled over, yelling at Nolan and me to back off, snapping at Paige to hold tight, don't move. Voice so gruff, it sounded like anger. For a split second, I thought he was about to call an ambulance, or at least move to help Paige. Instead, he told Mac to take her to the supervisor's office and call the owner on the emergency number, not 911. Paige kept up a steady whimper as Mac guided her out, hand wrapped in bloody towels. The next hour was a frozen, miserable haze. Work stopped. Nolan sat with his head in his hands. Phil paced nervously, checking the loading docks every few minutes, and I just stood there waiting for the sirens that never came. The owners showed up quickly, too quickly for someone living outside town, and headed straight into the office where Paige was waiting. Paige had stopped crying by then, her face so pale I thought she might faint. The owner spent 30 minutes behind closed doors with her. Nobody else was called in. No paramedics, no police, just the owner, the supervisor, and a girl whose hand looked broken in 3 places. When they finally emerged, Paige was quieter, her eyes downcast. The owner put her in his truck and drove off toward the outskirts of town, leaving Mac and Nolan looking as uneasy as I felt. The foreman announced Paige had quit and that someone else would take her place tomorrow. The machinery was fixed and cleaned by dawn, and when the morning crew came in, There was no sign anything had happened except a single blood-stained towel stuffed in the trash. It stuck with me. How quickly Paige vanished. How fast everything returned to normal. I tried to find out where she'd gone, but her phone went straight to voicemail, and her apartment was dark when I passed by. The supervisor shrugged it off, said the owner had taken care of her, and that was all anyone wanted to know. It was Nolan who finally gave me a clue. He was silent for days after the accident, but caught me outside having a smoke later that week. He stared out at the distant line of mountains and said quietly, "Third one in 6 years. Each time they pay him to leave." I pressed him, but his face stayed blank. It was only when I said Paige's name that he grimaced and muttered, "Every year someone gets hurt. Some take the cash, never come back." The owner's money, it turned out, was legendary among the old hands. Legal trouble threatened the cannery if anyone went to the hospital or tried to file a complaint. So instead of allowing police or OSHA investigations, injured workers were paid off under the table and sent out of town. The owner kept the payouts quiet. Nobody talked about it openly, but everyone knew. You got hurt, you got bought off, and you disappeared. Just another face in a town where silence was worth more than a paycheck. I could not let it go. Every shift, I asked quietly about Paige. A few of the line workers said she moved to Anchorage. Others claimed she was seen at the ferry dock leaving for Seattle. The supervisor grew hostile, warning me to stop asking questions unless I wanted to join her. Nolan looked exhausted and hollow, offering nothing more than, "Just keep working, young man. Do not get in the way." Eventually, I found old news reports about injuries at the cannery. 2 workers had been terminated following mysterious accidents over the past decade, each receiving a lump sum paid by the owner. There had never been a lawsuit, never an OSHA fine, never any police investigation. The record stopped there. In a town so small, where the cannery paid for the school lights and kept the fishing boats fueled, it seemed nobody wanted trouble. I tried to speak with Paige directly by tracking a bank transfer made to her old account, but she had closed it after a deposit of $15,000. $15,000 was enough to leave fast, but not enough to start over. I worried for her, wondered if she even knew what she had signed away in that office. Her health, her peace of mind, her right to call herself a local. By late fall, things were tense in the building. OSHA finally arrived after an anonymous complaint, but the inspection was delayed twice and included only a superficial review of the older machinery. The foreman was nervous all week, gruff and short with the crew, snapping at anyone who worked slowly or asked about repairs. I could see the fear in everyone's faces. One wrong move and a simple mistake could buy your silence too. When the inspection was over, and OSHA missed the structural flaws in the oldest equipment, I could not live with myself. I handed in my notice and left a written report with the federal office, including dates, names, and details of every injury I had heard about. I never told the foreman or the owner. I just left everything in the hands of someone who might care. The cannery shut down 2 months later. Word spread fast. OSHA had found dozens of violations on a surprise second inspection after complaints from a hospital nurse forced a deeper review. The owner was charged with multiple counts of negligence. People talked in whispers, afraid that the school would close or that the lights would go dark in town. But slowly the truth came out. A pattern of payoffs, of hurt men and women leaving with scars and money, and a town that had looked away each time it happened. I saw Nolan once after that, working a different job by the docks, older and slower, but finally unafraid. He nodded to me as I passed, and I wondered if he too had finally left behind the fear and guilt that grew from working in a place where wounds were traded for silence. As winter came on, I tried not to think of Paige, or of the others who vanished from town with money but without justice. I knew the owner would get a lawyer and might never see the inside of a cell. I knew the town would struggle without the cannery, and I knew that some people still blamed me and Nolan and anyone else who refused to play along. But truth is heavier than guilt, and when you open a wound that has been covered too long, the blood tells its own story. Workers who had stayed silent for years began to speak. They told of being paid off, of hands mangled and days spent in pain, afraid to cause trouble. They talked of the foreman's threats and the owner's payroll. They talked of leaving home, families broken, and futures lost. Paige's story was only one among many, but she was the one I could not forget. I still live in Cordova, working odd jobs and telling myself that if another factory or fishing operation opens, I will not be part of it unless I know the rules are different. The darkness in those long graveyard shifts was not just a matter of missed sunlight, but a shadow cast by every time someone chose hush money over a fellow worker's safety. Small towns are supposed to take care of their own, but some wounds fester in silence until the truth is forced to the surface. I cannot say for sure what happened to Paige. Maybe she made it somewhere better. Maybe she struggles with the same nightmares I do. What I do know is that towns like Cordova exist all over, hiding horror behind hard work and fishing money, convincing themselves that their secrets are safe so long as nobody says the words. But secrets rot what they touch, and the wounds left behind are always deeper than anyone is willing to admit. So if you ever find yourself in a place where everyone knows what happened, but nobody speaks aloud, remember what gets buried: memories, pain, truth, and the chance for justice. The factory gates may close, the money may run out, and strangers may come to investigate, but the damage done by silence never disappears. It lingers, waiting for someone to call it by its name. Every summer since I was 19, I have worked as a backcountry ranger for the United States Forest Service in the North Cascades of Washington State. My name is Haley. I am 31 years old now, and I have seen things in those mountains that most people would dismiss as impossible or ridiculous if I told them out loud. The work is hard and lonely, but I have always loved the isolation, the way the wilderness strips everything down to what matters. You learn to trust your instincts out there because sometimes your instincts are the only thing keeping you alive. What happened during my rotation at the Granite Ridge cabin in the summer of 2019 taught me that there are places in this world where humans are not welcome, where we are being watched by things that do not want us there, and where ignoring the warnings can cost you everything. The North Cascades are some of the most remote and rugged terrain in the continental United States. Jagged peaks, dense forests, glaciers that carve through valleys, and miles upon miles of wilderness where you can hike for days without seeing another person. The Forest Service maintains a network of backcountry cabins for rangers who patrol these areas during the summer months, checking trails, monitoring wildlife, and providing emergency assistance to hikers who get themselves into trouble. The rotations are typically 2 weeks on, 1 week off, and you spend those 2 weeks completely alone except for twice daily radio check-ins with the district office. Granite Ridge Cabin sits at the end of a 12-mile trail that climbs through old growth forest and alpine meadows before terminating at a small clearing overlooking a glacial lake. The cabin itself is basic: a single room with a wood stove, a cot, a table, shelves for supplies, and not much else. There is a hand pump for water outside, an outhouse 50 feet down the trail, and a solar panel that charges a battery for the radio and a single overhead light. It is primitive, but it is all you need when your job is to spend your days hiking the surrounding trails and your nights resting up to do it again the next day. I arrived at Granite Ridge on July 8th, 2019, after hiking in with a full pack of supplies and gear. The ranger I was replacing, a guy named Eric, who had been working the rotation before me, was supposed to meet me at the cabin to hand over the keys and give me a briefing on any issues or ongoing projects. But when I arrived, Eric was not there. The cabin door was unlocked, his gear was gone, and there was a note taped to the table that said he had left early due to a family emergency. He apologized for not being able to do a proper handoff and said everything I needed to know was in the logbook. I thought it was strange, but emergencies happen and I did not think much of it at the time. The first few days were perfect. The weather was clear, the trails were in good condition, and I fell into the rhythm of the work easily. Would wake at dawn, make coffee on the wood stove, pack a lunch, and head out to patrol whichever section of trail was on my schedule for the day. I would check for fallen trees, clear drainage ditches, document wildlife sightings, and mark any hazards that needed attention. In the evenings, I would return to the cabin, make dinner, do my radio check-in, and read or write in my journal until I was tired enough to sleep. It was exactly what I needed after a stressful spring, and I felt myself relaxing into the solitude. It was on the fourth day that I noticed the cairns. Cairns are stacks of rocks that hikers sometimes build as trail markers or just for fun, and they are common enough in popular areas. But the trails around Granite Ridge are not popular. Most people who come this far into the backcountry are experienced enough to know that unofficial cairns can be confusing and even dangerous if they lead someone off the established trail. I had cleared a section of trail near the cabin the day before, and I was certain there had been no cairns there. But when I hiked the same section the next morning, there were 3 of them, evenly spaced along the trail, each one about 2 feet tall and carefully constructed. I knocked them down, assuming some well-meaning but misguided hiker had built them without understanding the problems they could cause. But the next day, they were back. Same locations, same careful construction. I knocked them down again, and this time I made a note in the logbook to mention it during my next radio check-in. The dispatcher told me not to worry about it, that sometimes people build cairns overnight as a prank or a spiritual thing, and that as long as I kept clearing them, it would not be a problem. But the cairns kept appearing, and they were not just on the established trails anymore. I started finding them on game trails, leading off into the forest, away from the main route. I started finding them in places I knew I had not been, places where there was no reason for anyone to go. And they were always arranged the same way. 3 cairns in a line, evenly spaced, pointing deeper into the woods. Around the same time, I started noticing that supplies were going missing from the cabin. Small things at first. A flashlight that I had left on the shelf was gone. A package of batteries disappeared from the supply box. Food started vanishing from my pack, even though I always kept it sealed and stored properly to avoid attracting animals. I assumed it was mice or rats, even though I had seen no evidence of rodents in the cabin. But then larger items started disappearing. A first aid kit that had been sitting on the table vanished overnight. A coil of rope I had hung on a nail by the door was gone the next morning. These were not things that mice could carry off. I started locking the cabin door at night, even though there was no reason to lock it when you are 12 miles from the nearest road and the only other people around are hikers who would have no reason to steal from a Forest Service cabin. But it made me feel better, like I had some control over the situation. It did not help. Things kept disappearing. It was during my second week at the cabin that I found the journal. I was looking for a spare propane canister in the small storage locker beneath the floorboards near the stove. And tucked behind the canisters was a small notebook that had clearly been there for a while. The cover was water-stained and the pages were brittle, but the handwriting inside was still legible. It was Eric's journal, the ranger who had been there before me. The entries dated back 3 weeks, and they documented the same things I had been experiencing. Cairns appearing on the trails, supplies going missing, a growing sense that something was wrong. The final entries were more disturbing. Eric wrote about hearing footsteps on the roof of the cabin at night, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. He wrote about seeing figures moving through the trees at dusk, human-shaped but moving in ways that did not seem right. He wrote about feeling watched every time he left the cabin, like there were eyes following him from the forest. The last entry was dated the day before I arrived, and it was short. "They do not want us here. I am leaving tonight. Do not stay." I sat there on the floor of the cabin, holding Eric's journal and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up immediately and hike out, to follow Eric's warning and get as far away from Granite Ridge as I could. But another part of me, the stubborn part that had always pushed me to prove myself in this job, refused to be scared off by some missing supplies and a cryptic journal entry. I told myself Eric had been stressed, that isolation can do strange things to your mind, and that I was not going to abandon my post based on the paranoid ramblings of someone who had clearly been struggling. That decision almost cost me my life. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the roof. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Not the scrabbling of an animal, but the measured pace of something walking back and forth above me. I lay in my cot, frozen, listening to those footsteps move from one end of the cabin to the other and back again. It went on for hours. I did not move, did not make a sound. I barely allowed myself to breathe. And then, just before dawn, the footsteps stopped. I heard a soft thump as something jumped down from the roof, and then silence. I got up and looked out the window. The clearing around the cabin was empty, but at the edge of the tree line, I saw them. Figures, maybe 5 or 6 of them, standing just inside the shadows of the forest. They were human-shaped, but their proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that did not make sense. They stood completely still, and even though I could not see their faces in the darkness, I knew they were looking at me, watching me. I backed away from the window and grabbed the radio. I did not wait for the scheduled check-in time. I called for emergency extraction, my voice shaking as I told the dispatcher that I needed to leave immediately, that I was not safe, that I needed a helicopter pickup as soon as possible. The dispatcher tried to calm me down, tried to ask what was wrong, but I could not explain it. I just kept repeating that I needed to leave, that I could not stay another night. The helicopter arrived 6 hours later, landing in the meadow below the cabin. I had packed my essential gear and was waiting outside, refusing to go back into the cabin or look toward the tree line. The pilot gave me a strange look when he saw my face, but he did not ask questions. He just told me to get in, and within minutes, we were lifting off and flying back toward the district office. My supervisor was less understanding. He wanted to know what had happened, why I had called for emergency extraction, what emergency had justified the expense of a helicopter when I could have just hiked out. I tried to explain, but I could hear how it sounded. Footsteps on the roof, figures in the forest, missing supplies. It sounded like I had cracked under the isolation, like I had let my imagination run wild. He told me to take the rest of the summer off, that we would discuss my future with the Forest Service when I was feeling more stable. I did not argue. I just wanted to be away from those mountains, away from that cabin, away from whatever those things were that had been watching me. But before I left the office, I asked about Eric, the ranger who had been at Granite Ridge before me. My supervisor's expression changed. He told me Eric had requested a transfer to a different district immediately after finishing his rotation. When I asked why, my supervisor hesitated before admitting that Eric had reported similar experiences. Unexplained occurrences, a sense of being watched, increasing paranoia. The Forest Service had chalked it up to isolation stress and granted the transfer without asking too many questions. I did some research after that. I talked to other rangers who had worked in the North Cascades, and I learned that Granite Ridge had a reputation. Multiple rangers over the years had requested early extraction or transfers after working that cabin. Nobody talked about it openly, but everyone knew. There was something wrong with that place, something that did not want people there. I also reached out to a cultural liaison from the Sauk Suiattle tribe, whose traditional territory includes the North Cascades. When I mentioned Granite Ridge, she nodded slowly and told me that the area around that cabin had always been considered a boundary, a place where the human world ends and something else begins. She said her people had avoided that area for generations, that there were stories about the old ones who lived in those mountains and did not welcome outsiders. She told me I was lucky to have listened to my instincts and left when I did, because those who stayed too long often did not come back the same. I never returned to Granite Ridge. I finished out that summer working at the district office, and the following year I requested a transfer to a different forest entirely. I still work as a backcountry ranger, and I still love the wilderness. But I have learned to recognize when I am not wanted. There are places in this world that belong to something older than us, something that was here before we arrived and will be here long after we are gone. And those places have ways of making it clear when we have crossed a line that should not be crossed. The cairns, the missing supplies, the figures in the forest, those were warnings. And I am grateful that I was smart enough to listen before it was too late.